Hello, and welcome to The Third Space, the podcast for those who see the beauty of Catholicism as well as the ugliness, who've experienced real harm and real grace in the Church. I'm your host, Paul Fahey, a mental health counselor and catechist. In every episode, I will have conversations with guests about the good and the bad in the Church, avoiding easy answers or black and white fundamentalism in order to hold on to all that is true. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Shaun Blanchard about Cardinal Newman, conscience, and synodality. Shaun is a senior lecturer in theology at the University of Notre Dame, Australia on the Sydney campus, a North Carolina native and graduate of UNC, Oxford, Blackfriars Hall, and Marquette. Shaun writes on a variety of topics in early modern and modern Catholicism, especially Jansenism, Catholic Enlightenment, the history of the papacy, and the Vatican councils. Shaun, it's great to have you back on the podcast. You're, if not a fan favorite, one of my favorites to continue to have on the podcast.
That's nice of you to say.
Last time you were on just before Christmas, we talked about St. John Henry Newman and him recently becoming a doctor of the Church and your involvement in that. We discussed some of his thoughts on the development of doctrine, kind of a perennial topic that you and I have discussions about. But I had wanted to dive into in that conversation, but we didn't get to, was some of Newman's contributions to the Church's understanding today of both conscience and the sense of the faithful, and then specifically how that relates to synodality, which wasn't obviously anything that Newman talked about directly, but it seems like all of these principles connect to that pretty closely. And kind of how all of that means for Pope Francis's vision of the Church and now Leo's vision of the Church. So kind of a grab bag, but I think it all holds together.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree.
I ended our last discussion with a question. So how I want to frame this discussion is I'm going to ask that question again, and then we're going to like step way back and kind of from like build some foundations in order to even approach the question. So here's the question. It's kind of long, but it builds from the last of our couple conversations. If it's true that church teaching does change, and that is true, we do know that. And if it's true that we can't know in the moment what parts of current magisterial teachings are unchanging substance, and what parts can change, and sometimes even be reversed, right? And this is Newman's analogy I like to use of how the caterpillar turns into a butterfly. We see this with the Church's teaching on slavery. We see this in other things where things that felt like substantial parts of a doctrine ended up not being because the Church ended up changing them. So if we know that church teaching changes, and we know that in the moment we can't always clearly discern what's unchanging and what isn't, and we know that some things that are very clear in Scripture, like slavery, can change, then how does a Catholic who wants to be faithful to the Church, but who feels convicted in their conscience that a particular teaching is wrong, or say violates human dignity, how does that Catholic advocate for change and still be faithful to the Church? How does someone do that in a way that's in line with the Church's own way of thinking, and that doesn't promote dissent or disunity? Just a really easy, casual question. But I think to lay the groundwork, I first want to talk about conscience. In earlier episodes of the podcast, I've outlined the Church's teaching on conscience pretty extensively, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. But we have from Vatican II three different understanding conscience in three different ways. First, it's the understanding that it's this innermost sanctuary where I'm alone with God. Second, it's this understanding of where I can come to know the objective moral law. And then third, it's my capacity. It's my place of freedom and discernment and culpability, where I can kind of bring together the moral law into this innermost sanctuary and discern where God is calling me to act in concrete ways in the concrete situations that I'm in. so these three aspects of conscience coming out of Vatican II. Um, but I'm curious what Newman's contributions to these understandings are, and how his theology of conscience may have been different from other theologies of conscience at his time, because his theology seems forward thinking to Vatican II. Um, so, yeah, maybe start there. How was Newman's understanding of conscience in relationship to the other theologies of conscience back in the mid 19th century?
Yeah, so it's I think really important for this and for everything that we're going to discuss to keep we want to keep Newman in his historical context, but also allow him to speak to us in ours. So I would say in his historical context, he's trying his initial problem as an Anglican Christian in the 1820s when he becomes a priest. He's preaching, he's directing, doing spiritual direction. He's very involved with his congregation. Then he becomes the university preacher, so he's preaching to these very bright Oxford undergrads and also his colleagues. The main context that he's afraid or that he's pushing against, the main problem is a kind of capital L liberal view that he sees um, mainly infecting English culture at the time, but also making inroads into the church, where the conscience is a kind of creation of the individual, a creation of the self. So you know that if you remember the line I thought of, you always have to be careful. Christopher Hitchens made a joke once about like quoting G.K. Chesterton is always a dubious affair. You never know if he's and it is always like Chesterton can be a double-edged sword, but he does have this brilliant line about the Quaker doctrine of the inner light. Do you remember this? He says
No.
like, he was talking to this really lovely person at a, train stop or whatever. And the guy said, I feel that Christ just came to, illuminate us about the inner light that we already have within us. And Chesterton claims that he said something like, if Christ came specifically to destroy that doctrine, it would be closer to the truth. Sort of the idea that you yourself have sort of created this thing. So he's pushing against this kind of, I don't know, relativist, subjectivist, whatever it might be. And that's his original fear. So he emphasizes, there's a lot of beautiful writing about Newman and conscience, by people that have examined it in much more depth than me, but I've benefited from their work and reading Newman himself. But the real key takeaway, I think, is that conscience for Newman, and this is a constant throughout his life, is God sort of within you, as it were. So in this sense, it is paradoxically you and within you, and it is an external authority, which is why it is so sacred for him. So to trample on, to then get to his other worry, to trample on one's conscience is not to violate the dignity of the person as a person per se, or to take away someone's democratic rights or something like that. It's actually an offense against God, because it's attempting to shut off the valve of how God might be working within Paul or within Shaun. So it ends up promoting the dignity of the person, but through a very kind of like hierarchical understanding, which is that the priest, the pope, the bishop does not have the authority to speak in place of God in your heart,
How is
right?
how is how is his understanding of conscience received in his time? Obviously, it was wholeheartedly adopted by the Church at Vatican II, but how was
Yeah.
it received a century before?
So I think that the technical it sometimes surprises people today, but I mean you can get pretty far to the contemporary understanding in the Catechism, which quotes Newman. You can get pretty far just from Aquinas, right? So like there's some pretty solid medieval early church biblical foundations for our current understanding of conscience. I think where Newman, and I know we'll talk about this as we sort of move on in this conversation, but when it gets linked to the laity and to ecclesiology, that's where it gets dicey. I think to say in the abstract, you must follow your conscience, a conscience is inviolable, but things like that in and of itself is not controversial. It's when it becomes a question of um, reception of teaching or rights of laity or something like that. That's where it gets dicey. So the other fear, there's the capital L liberalism. There's also, maybe we could call it ultramontane or clericalist or whatever. And I don't mean everyone who's ultramontane or everyone who had a clericalist understanding thought this way, but the idea that I think you've said before, the magisterium replaces the conscience.
Yeah.
The magisterium is irreplaceable for Newman, but the magisterium is a authority structure below God that helps us form our consciences, but it doesn't replace it. And I think there was a horrible exaggeration in Newman's day, and there are all kinds of reasons for this, that, anyone who looks into kind of the lead up to Vatican I will instantly recognize this stuff: political stuff, cultural stuff, and theological stuff. But there was a kind of revelation on tap mentality with the most extreme ultramontanes, and there's a variety of quotes that people always go to with Newman of the W.G. Ward saying, I want a, just leaning into the absurdity of the kind of the terminus of ultramontanism. I want an infallible papal bull every morning with my breakfast. I'll read the
I
Times, and
mean,
then I'll read,
I do.
you want
Honestly,
that too, yeah, of
if
course.
there was a new papal exhortation every morning, I'd be
Yeah,
happy.
yeah. I cringe. I cringe whenever I say these things, because I'm on the editorial board of the Newman Studies Journal, and the amount of submissions where you have exactly the same leading quote, I wanted infallible papal, and then it's like, Newman, of course, would not have agreed with this. It's like, yes, we know this, but these are important. And then there's this ridiculous one from, I'm blanking on, I have it in front of me, actually. It's Monsignor George Talbot says this ridiculous thing in front of Newman. He says, what is the province of the laity? So this is the clericalist element. What is the province of the laity? Meaning, what is their remit? What are they good for? He says, to hunt, to shoot, to entertain. These matters they understand. Obviously, he's hanging out with wealthy people. He doesn't mean poor people in a slum in London, right? To hunt, to shoot, to entertain. These matters they understand. But to meddle with ecclesiastical matters, they have no right at all. So Newman, this is where Newman was. He maybe in the shower later, you realize what you should have said, and he's what he should have said was, well, we'd look pretty silly without the laity, right? I mean, this is the famous line. I don't think he actually said it. I think he realized later he should have said it. So this is the sort of culture where he leaves the Anglican Church, he becomes Catholic. He's still concerned with liberalism, capital L liberalism, which he sees as I think, a primarily cultural problem facing the West. Within the Catholic Church, he's worried that an opposite reaction has occurred. And there's such a distancing from any possible modern error that there's this sort of exaggerated clericalism. But as we know, if you and you see this in the Catechism, lays this out beautifully. When you actually look at Aquinas, you see this very, very robust view of the conscience, because Aquinas was completely immersed in these Christian and also Jewish sources.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So then, I mean, one of Newman's most famous quotes comes from his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, and he says, "I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still, to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards." So am I right in understanding that quip as that recognition that the authority of the Church, the authority of the magisterium, is below God?
Yes.
And the conscience is the voice of God in the individual heart. That's the framework that the Newman's engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. So he describes the conscience in the same letter. It's really a book. It's a short book, letter to the Duke of Norfolk. The Duke of Norfolk is like the leading Catholic layman, which kind of goes back to this old recusant world where it really was the laity keeping Catholicism alive in England, who could afford to have hide priests originally, and then patronize these communities. But so it's notable that he's writing to the Duke of Norfolk. He's writing a letter to a layperson about how to reconcile Vatican I with previous teaching, with their own conscience, with the fears of the British government. And it's very public facing as well. I mean, it's meant also as a reply to Gladstone, the prime minister. So in the same letter, he describes conscience as the aboriginal vicar of Christ, meaning literally from the origin. like uh, the original voice of God in the person, or of Christ, the original voice before we have any catechesis, certainly papal bulls and all these sorts of things. We have the experience, which to properly understand it for Newman it is outside of you, in the sense that he has all these beautiful reflections on moral formation. As children, we understand we didn't come up with this rule, and we're accountable to this. Our behavior is accountable to something outside of us, that is also not dependent upon whether our parents are watching or a teacher is watching. There's some
Yeah.
sort of legislative rule. And he has this amazing reflection. We feel the praise of that external force when we are in accord with our conscience, and we feel the condemnation of it when we're not. Even
Yeah.
sometimes, especially when we're not being watched by our parents or our teachers or our peers, right?
Yeah.
Doing good when no one's watching or
I,
whatever, that sort of thing.
yeah. I think how the Catechism articulates it is it's a coming to recognize an awareness of an objective moral law or an objective moral norm, not the creation of a
Yeah,
moral
exactly.
norm.
Exactly. So if we want to be pithy in the summary, danger A, capital L liberalism for him, is that you create it, and it's this process of self-discovery, right? So, moral therapeutic deism, what we would call it now, maybe, or Christian Smith would call it. And then the other fear is the magisterium or your spiritual director just tells you.
Yep.
And if your conscience has a problem with that, well, it's a badly formed conscience, or you don't even talk about that, or that's irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
And Newman is sitting in that tension, in a way that I think probably there were many good preachers and spiritual directors who were doing this, but I think he's the most prominent person who's writing these kind of accessible, public-facing things, really wrestling with it.
So
That's why it's such an important contribution, I think.
maybe my favorite line from Newman on conscience. This is in his essay on the development of doctrine, which is also not an essay; it's also a book.
Yeah. Yeah, and a
um,
bigger than the letter. Yeah, a big one.
um, he says this: referring to conscience, mistakes error for truth, and yet we believe that on the whole, and even in those cases where it's ill-instructed, if its voice be diligently obeyed, it will gradually be cleared, simplified, and perfected, so that minds starting differently will, if honest, in course of time converge to one and the same truth. How I understand this is, I mean, to use very much my own language, that if someone is, in the depths of their heart, in the core of who they are, seeking after what is good and true and beautiful, that even if they stumble and get it wrong and go on divergent paths, that they will find what is good and true and beautiful at some point. Um, that there is I mean, I would frame it even less that they will find, but that there is an openness to God finding them, the goodness and truth and beauty itself, finding them, as long as there is this um, genuineness to follow that direction of conscience. Am I understanding that
Definitely.
correctly?
I think so, and I think it's no coincidence that he's talking about this in the context of doctrinal development, because I think it's the same thing. The mistakes are not. I mean, sin is sin, and he has blistering. He's actually a quite rigorous preacher, but the path that we have hope, not that every step of the path will be right, but that we're being guided in a destination, right? And it could be, maybe we culpably go wrong at parts, and maybe we don't, actually, because to follow, when you're truly following your conscience, you can just make a mistake. that has no
Yep.
malice behind it, that isn't, it is sinful perhaps in principle, but your culpability is low, is diminished or zero, right? So, and then you would be open to a kind of correction that might come internally, it might come from a pastor,
So,
it might come from your spouse, whatever it might be.
so what's interesting to me, or one of the interesting things about then this disposition, is that it's deeply trustworthy, both of God and of human nature in light of God. Like it is not suspicious, right? And not just in like a strict, like more Calvinistic, depraved sense of suspicion of humanity, but even within more, rigid flavors of Catholicism today, you get this suspicion of human desires and,
Definitely.
and, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
human nature. This doesn't have that. There's something inherently hopeful within
Hmm.
this anthropology.
Absolutely. And he comes from a, I think the culture within Anglicanism that he's coming out of is more of this, what Protestants call Armenian, which is an openness to emphasizing free will in the equation of salvation. So for us it was Jansenists versus Jesuits, and for many Protestants it was Armenian versus Calvinist. And he's definitely in this kind of, God has poured his grace out on the world to everyone. Even, and he says things about the salvation of non-Christians as an Anglican and as a Catholic that are, that read directly, they read like Vatican II doctrine to me. And we know there were pre-Vatican II people who affirmed all of this, including popes, right? But the idea that the salvation of the non-Christian, I mean, I guess where he goes even further is, he has sometimes harsh things to say about non-Christian religions, and sometimes appropriately, but he also recognizes there is actually grace and truth in the myths and the customs and the beliefs of the non-Christian people. Kind of similar to C.S. Lewis, if you read Mere Christianity, when
Yep.
he the sort of the way that he expresses that is very Newmanian, I think, and I've no doubt that Lewis knew Newman and read him and knew him on this point as well. So there is I agree with you. There's a rigorism on certain. I mean, he's all about fasting. He's all about rigorously examining your conscience and being suspicious of, really wanting to get down to the nitty gritty of your motivations. But there's also an optimism that if you're doing that, your hand is being held by grace. So it is somewhat paradoxical sometimes, but absolutely the destination is, I think, optimism. Um, there's one other point. Oh, in his own life, this is very biographical for him. So sometimes we do this with all doctors of the church. This was my fear of, I was thrilled he was named a doctor of the church, but my fear was we sometimes rip them out of their historical context and of their biographical context. So like when you're reading Dark Night of the Soul, like you have to think hard about like, what is John of the Cross actually going through in this moment? And when we're reading Teresa of Avila, same thing, whoever it might be, right? So for Newman, he really had to examine his conscience as he became more and more attracted to Catholicism. He was asking himself questions like, is it because I'm frustrated with the Anglican Church? Is it simply resentment at the way things haven't gone my way, because they hadn't in many ways? Is it actually diabolical? Is this a deception of evil, where I see these beautiful liturgies and I see this ancient tradition and I love the church fathers? So he really had to discern that, and it took him years. And he finally, and it sounds very Ignatian, it's like the
Yeah.
spirit of peace is ultimately what won out. So he converted to Catholicism ultimately, as hard as it was, because he felt more peace following that path than not following that path. But it took years for him to discern that. And I think he sees this as appropriate and good and part of how God leads finite sinful people.
So he's speaking then, you're saying it not only out of a, you know, great theological understanding, but he's also trying to articulate his own experience of this
Yeah,
in a really
absolutely.
personal way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, to shift to some of like, okay, you had said, I mean, there's a lot of things that the church says about conscience that everyone agrees with, but then once you start like getting down into some of of the nitty gritty of, well, what does that mean when you juxtapose or put into conflict or dialogue individual conscience and ecclesiology or church teaching. Um, One of my favorite lines from Pope Paul VI, he said this in a somewhat famous address he gave after the council when he promulgated the Reformed liturgy. It's kind of there's a lot of grief, actually, like sorrow in what's being lost in the pre-Reformed liturgy. But then we're moving on from those things because of these great things we're moving towards, right? And like one of those things he talks about in the liturgy is that he envisions the Reformed liturgy, that it needs to be reformed so that we can foster, quote, so he wants it to foster in the whole church, in the lay faithful, he says this, their sense of the baptismal priesthood. Quote, the faithful are also invested with the royal priesthood. That is, they are qualified to have supernatural conversations with God. End quote. So this lines up a lot with what you just said about Newman in the sense of like, this is Christ speaking to me. But to ask like a really blunt question then, if I can have supernatural conversations with God as a royal baptized priest, why do I need priests? Why do I need the magisterium? How does this not quickly devolve into something more individualistic? And like how it seems like these are questions Newman was also navigating. How does he navigate this? How is someone, their conscience being the aboriginal vicar of Christ? Well, if that's the case, like, why do I need the vicar of Christ in Rome?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I just read an excellent essay by Bernard Dive, an English guy who just finished his doctorate at Cambridge, and he wrote on this question of Newman and conscience. He'd be a good person for you to speak to. But he cited something I don't recall reading in Newman. It was early. I think it was the 1840s. But he says something like the I don't know if he uses the term magisterium. He might say bishops and popes are it sounded so modern, a supply to meet a demand. and and I think what he meant by that, and it's expounded very beautifully by Bernard Dive. What he meant by that is God's plan of revelation, which is multifaceted for Newman, right? Because he's saying it's in the individual conscience is a sort of almost a piece of God, a voice of God. It's in culture. It's even in a mitigated secondary sense in other religions. But the role of the bishops, the role of the Pope, is as a kind of arbiter during this process, what he sees as this process of development. So but for him, this is a kind of single organism. This is sort of single ecclesial organism. This is all kind of in the air. The theory of evolution is 1840s, 50s, 60s. Romanticism, coming out of Germany and also in Britain. So there's a lot of interest in kind of this big picture organic development, different sort of philosophical streams. So I think he's like influenced by this and he's tapping into this. So for him, there's this kind of single ecclesial organism, and we are all, this is very biblical as well, right? And we're all actively participating in it, right? To use something about the new liturgy, right? So you, Paul, have a role in this that is a bigger role than his kind of clericalist opponents would want to admit. But against what he sees as capital L liberal Christianity, you are actually under the authority of pastors. So in the sense that there are moments where ex cathedra definitions, ecumenical councils, things like that, that are providing these monuments of the tradition. So he's very much against a kind of choose your own adventure Christianity. So when you and for him also the formation of the conscience is occurring ideally, hopefully, in the family, in a loving family where the faith is lived beautifully rather than coercively. And it's a recognition. So to accurately um, understand your conscience is to have it formed in the tradition. So your conscience is sharpened. Your conscience exists no matter what. If you're the hypothetical kid raised by wolves that Aquinas talks about, if you're an Aztec, if you're a Hindu, if you're Irish, English, Scottish, whatever you are, your conscience is there. It's being formed, and the magisterium for Newman is a special has a special role and office in discerning God's revelation, but that discernment is the entire body.
Yeah.
These are the leaders of the body.
Yeah. So, I think a clear thing here. So, in my understanding of conscience, there's a clear thing that God's revelation is always mediated. Like that's the means by which God chooses to reveal himself, always in a mediated way. And the mediators are, because they're created, are always limited. So therefore there's always the need to discern, because God's revelation is not beamed pure and perfect into my mind ever. So there's this need for the body of Christ, and then specifically the apostles and their successors, the magisterium, to always be interpreting the revelation of God, not speaking on behalf of God as if they could, in an unmediated way, speak on behalf of God, but to always be growing in understanding of God's revelations, scripture and tradition, because scripture and tradition are limited because they're mediated. So they always need interpretation. There's always more to understand. So if I want to come to know God's revelation, God's will for my life, I instead of venturing off on my own, it sounds like what Newman is saying, I seek after those who have been set in authority as being those who best understand God's revelation. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. And this conversation has also made, if to to summarize, I think I've never thought of it this way actually until just now, but so if liberal, what he calls capital L liberal Christianity or culture is making the self a god, right? Which these like ultramontane fire breathers would agree with, right? Like, it's the non serviam of Satan. That's for them, and this includes like parliamentary democracies and like for some of these extreme reactionaries. For Newman, he's talking about fundamentally a theological problem, not a political problem. Although he's pretty conservative politically, but he's talking about a theological problem. So you make you're kind of creating your own divinity within, right? But the opposite error is that the pastors or the bishops or the pope, the authority, are making themselves God, right? And
Yep.
and this is why Lumen Gentium is an amazing synthesis of so much of this, and it's via Congar primarily, I think. I mean, that could perhaps be debated, but the Newmanian imprint on Lumen Gentium is via Congar, and the idea that the magisterium, and he's in close dialogue with Protestants, which of course was offended a lot of people, but the magisterium is not above the word of God, it says in Lumen Gentium, but serves it.
Yep.
Now,
Yeah.
in theory, abstractly, everyone would always have had to affirm that. But in practice, in Newman's life, it was getting really dangerously close for some people. I mean, there were hymns being sung. This is in John O'Malley's Vatican I book and some other sources, but that look pretty blasphemous about hymns to Pius IX while he's alive, which are using like Holy Spirit like language, right? So this is a reaction. We always have to give people some benefit of the doubt that they're reacting against real problems, but it's a terrible, terrible overreaction Whereas Newman, he sometimes uses language that is, and this is the great in the Christian tradition, it happens a lot, that can sound dangerously pantheistic because of, sacraments and incarnation, or the idea of God being actually within you, or you actually becoming God, right?
Yeah.
Through theosis and things. But it's actually to do that correctly is the best remedy against either of these other two errors,
So
where you actually are God or where your leaders are God. That's
this be some.
the safety rails, actually, is to affirm Paul's conscience is God speaking to Paul.
So
Ironically,
then,
is the safety against divinizing you or divinizing your bishop or the pope, right?
yeah. Francis has this line from Amoris Laetitia: the church has been called to form consciences, not to replace them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In this framework, replacing a conscience is to take the place of God. This seems to
Yeah,
be
and it's
Francis.
a it's actually a theological error, right? It's not
Yeah.
just bad pastoral practice, right? And I think some of Francis's invective against, which I don't know, maybe sometimes went too far, but talking about Pharisees and all that. I mean, this is what he's talking about. Um,
So
I know you and I know examples of this. We probably won't go into them, but I mean, this was a huge problem when I was coming up. And a lot of it, you talk
yeah,
about this in some of your episodes on spiritual abuse. I mean, generally well-meaning people, sometimes evil people that are taking advantage, actively taking advantage, but often it's well-meaning. I actually know what's best for this young person or this vulnerable person or even just this friend of mine, but you cross a line. So Newman sets up, I think, these guardrails that you can admonish, you can advise, but there is a limit to where you step with a person.
where even the Pope, the highest teaching authority in the church, can step with a person. Yeah. Okay.
I want to
So
say, I want to say, no, no, you go ahead. I'll bring this up later when we get to the historical context again.
okay. So I want to shift to talking about the sense of the faithful because this seems really closely tied in. Uh,
Well,
Pope Leo.
in that case, let me just wrap up one thing with the letter to the Duke of Norfolk. I'll be very brief. So, one of the challenges, a distinction I want to make, which I think will come into the ecclesiological discussion as well. So, when it comes to does the Pope and or the Pope in union with the College of Bishops, which much of Newman's life is pre-Vatican I, where that's not totally resolved, right? But the highest teaching authority of the church, when it teaches doctrine strictly understood, for Newman is to be adhered to. But he makes it very important distinctions in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk about action. So not if, Pope Pius V does say, I excommunicate Queen Elizabeth and I release her subjects from their oaths of allegiance, which means de facto, she's not the queen, she's a tyrant, she could be deposed, killed, you aid the Spanish invaders, etc. English Catholics had by and large rejected this and had defended the crown in most circumstances. You always had extremists like the Gunpowder Plot, right? Newman in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk is saying, and he was actually investigated. There's an amazing article by a Dominican sister who spent a lot of time in the Vatican archives. They open a case on Newman's sort of like calumny against the Holy Fathers, and they ultimately decide not to condemn him, and it was pretty half-hearted. But going back into the historical record and saying the Pope has the right to say, this is the Catholic faith, and Elizabeth has fallen short of that. He does not have the right to say, Englishmen now aid a Spanish army to topple their queen, and you're right to refuse him. So when he's saying, I toast the conscience first and then the Pope, he's talking about something like you have the at the level of principle, a doctrine, and then you have the action that is then you're told logically flows from it. Okay, I can think of some examples today,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what he's taught. He's like, the action cannot be coerced or compelled. But at the level of principle, if the Pope judges this Anglican understanding of the Eucharist or ordination is heretical, that is not something where you toast your conscience and not the Pope, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is his understanding. I mean, maybe we could argue this, but when the Pope then says, "Well, Paul, you now rebel against, you're justified in striking up armed rebellion against Donald Trump or Barack Obama." Whoa, whoa, whoa! No, that's probably pretty easy for Americans to understand. Not a given in the highly contested climate of the 1870s, where the Pope
Yeah.
has now proclaimed himself infallible. Right? This is the big problem. So anyway, I wanted to touch on that briefly.
No, that's helpful. So a couple weeks ago, Pope Leo gave uh, his ongoing catechesis on Lumen Gentium, and he talks about the sense of the faithful, the sensus fidei. And a friend of mine texted me after reading it, and she's like, so I think I understand it, I guess, but like, well, what does it mean in practice? And we had a whole conversation about how we don't actually know what this means. So I want to read this passage. It's a little long, but I want to read this passage uh, from Pope Leo's catechesis a couple weeks ago, and then unpack it in light of all that we just talked about, and the relationship between individual conscience and church authority. So this is Pope Leo. He says, the Council Fathers then teach that the holy people of God also participate in the prophetic mission of Christ. In this context, the important theme of the sense of the faith and the consensus of the faithful is introduced. The doctrinal commission of the Council specified that the sensus fidei is like a faculty of the whole Church, by which she in her faith recognizes the revelation handed down, distinguishing between true and false in matters of faith, and at the same time it penetrates it more deeply and applies it more fully in life. The sense of faith, therefore, belongs to individual believers, not in their own right, but as members of the people of God as a whole. Lumen Gentium focuses on this latter aspect and places it in relation to the infallibility of the Church, to which that of the Roman Pontiff is inherent and by which it is served. The entire body of the faithful, anointed as they are by the Holy One, cannot err in matters of belief. They manifest this special property by means of the whole people's supernatural discernment in matters of faith, when from the bishops down to the last of the lay faithful, they show universal agreement in matters of faith and morals. The Church, therefore, as the communion of the faithful, which naturally includes the pastors, cannot err in matters of faith. The organ through which this truth is preserved, founded on the anointing of the Holy Spirit, is the supernatural sense of faith of the entire people of God, which is manifested in the consensus of the faithful. Okay. What does that mean? Like, it can't mean something like democratic majority. It's not like we vote on what doctrines are true or not. It kind of seems like it just means that what the church has always believed is what the church believes, but that seems like a meaningless tautology. And then, like, universal agreement amongst the whole people of God feels like a joke. I mean, I literally texted my friend in this conversation. I think the only time there's been, universal agreement amongst the whole people of God is when Adam and Eve both agreed to eat the apple, right? Like, there's never been universal agreement.
Two out of yeah,
this fe-
two out of two vote, and then it's downhill from there.
yeah,
Yeah.
it feels like, I mean, when people appeal to, like, when theologians appeal to the consensus of the church fathers, I'm like, well, which
Hmm.
ones? And
Yeah,
what do you mean
absolutely.
by consensus?
Yeah.
Um, so what
And
is
what
this?
documents do we have as well? I've always wondered with
Yeah.
that, like, yeah.
So what does this mean? Because it seems to be, on one sense, like, there seems to be a sense of wanting to elevate the whole of the people of God into this. Even like, he brings up the idea of infallibility, and this is the organ through which the truth is preserved. But at the end of the day, does it just mean the Pope? Like, what does this mean?
Yeah, so it's interesting how you have this condemnation of conciliarism or many elements of conciliarism at Vatican I, this exaltation of the Pope, and unfortunately the Pope alone in many conceptions of this. And then you have this recovery at Vatican II, which was, of course, gestating for many decades, and you see in Newman as well. But you have this recovery of um, democratizing elements I think it would be safe to say, like, if we're drawing political analogies and the Pope is a monarch, the cardinals or the bishops are parliament, aristocracy, whatever, and then this is democratizing in that limited sense. I don't think we should think of the church as a monarchy or a democracy or anything like that. But when we draw these political analogies, so there's this kind of universalizing element. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, one thing I would say, you're in good company when you make this joke about universal agreement with Adam and Eve. I don't know if are you familiar with Cardinal Ottaviani's joke about collegiality? Have you heard this?
No.
Apparently, he was very frustrated with how a vote went in, like, I think the second or third session on collegiality, which he opposed. And he said, I can, something like, I can think of one collegial action in the Gospels, and it was all running away in the garden. you know, so yeah, I thought that was quite funny. Okay, now, is it a tautology? It. I think when the goal of infallibility talk is to try to find an airtight list of propositions, all of this descends into tautology. I mean, we can find some like, we would be very confident with the first few ecumenical councils with the creed, saying there are certain propositions that now 2,000 years later we are very confident, um, unlike no salvation outside the church, Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man. We don't want to
Yeah.
revise that, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to say, well, but you got to understand. I mean, you do have to explain it, obviously, right? And they were explaining it for hundreds of years. I mean, until probably the 7th century, right? With Constantinople III or whatever. Now, it can get tautological when you're trying to say, we want to look for sensus fidelium throughout history and extract propositions and then sort of freeze them, right? Which is what a lot of people want to do. And you and I have discussed this, but unfortunately there's a kind of cottage industry on the internet of saying, are you confused because of Protestantism or because of your religion or secularism? Well, we have a confusion-free place for you. We have a place where there isn't really any legitimate
Oh, we've
debate.
always taught in every century
Yeah,
this thing.
exactly. Exactly. And I think that I actually tie some of this to ecumenism in a positive sense, and of course there are many Catholics that would disagree strongly with this. But I mean, when the Catholic Church at Vatican II takes a strongly ecumenical turn, and you have people like Congar who are in the dialogue that they're in, I do think there is a relativization of certain periods of church history, in the sense that there is clearly coming out of Vatican II, and even with people like Ratzinger, who are beloved now by traditionalists or by many traditionalists, right? That there are formulations. They do this with scripture and tradition. They do this with Bible reading. They do this with all kinds of questions, ecclesiological questions. There are formulations which have to be relativized in light of their historical context. And that sounded to the council minority like modernism, right?
Yep.
So unlike Newman's day, where, I mean, you get the very beginnings of that, I think, in the 1880s and 90s of what we now call modernism properly. So he's very, very old man when that actual modernist movement begins. But it's really post Newman. You have a new way of stating the problem, and you have another overreaction, which is to say, there's some crazy guys that are saying, undermining the faith, therefore Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and we know this for sure. So there's this kind of, again, an anxiety about a real problem, and then trying to say, we can cordon off this stuff and we can be certain, right? Now, we have to do that I think, to be monotheists and to be faithful Christians who believe in a divine revelation. There is a core that I think we do that with. I think there is no agreement for the most part about the extent of that core, right? Because you'd get Catholics who say things about the relationship with church and state is in that core, and you're just a
Yep.
heretic if you don't. I mean, the Pope doesn't say that, the bishops don't say that, but there's plenty of people saying that because they're afraid that when sectors of human life get out into the ambiguity of reality, I would
Well,
say, that's scary,
yeah,
right?
yeah, or even things like, I mean, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith came out with a document on Mary last fall that was like, yeah, we should not be using, the understanding Mary as the mediatrix of all graces. And people were like, wait. No. That's an unchanging doctrine in the, like,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah. Uh,
Co-redemptrix. Yeah,
yep. Yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. Like, maybe we could all agree on the creed, probably. But at some point, pretty quickly after that, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of disagreement on what is universal, always unchanging, and
And
what's not.
how to and how to understand it, right? So where it becomes, I think, a tautology is when you don't allow for a reassessment of, like, the way we now interpret no salvation outside the church is there is an integral link between the salvation of any human being and the mission of the church on earth, right? In some way.
Yep.
But ultimately, we clearly don't think that outside the visible bounds of the Catholic Church, no one can be saved. And I guess to bring it full circle, where I would, the room for disagreement that's legitimate, in my view, is when there are tools in the toolbox of the tradition that can be brought out. So if you're in 15th century Florence, Council of Florence, no, Jews, heretics, schismatics, Muslims outside the faith, damned, right? You go, okay, hang on a second. I mean, of course, at this point, only a highly, highly educated, very small group of people could have done this at all, right? But hang on a second. We have this idea of the seeds of the word. We have this idea of the baptism of desire. Are we really sure that every Jew and every Muslim is impenitent, that knows the gospel and is culpably rejected? It doesn't seem that way to me. So I would say you have to have a posture of docility. You have to say, first and foremost, I might be wrong, Your Excellency, or Holy Father, or whoever you're talking to. Hopefully not the Inquisition, but whoever you were talking to. But it seems to me that God's salvific will includes all, and I hope that in some way unknown to me, my Jewish neighbors, my Muslim, the guys I trade with at the port and wherever, might come to salvation. I submit to your authority. I respect your authority. I am limited, but I was taught how to read Greek by my tutor, and I read Justin Martyr. I don't know, that kind of challenging is productive. Now you could run across an authority figure who simply squashes you,
So,
but I think it's got to be something coming from the logic of the tradition, the grammar of the tradition. This is where
so
sensus
that
fidelium is also important.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to move it then to a discussion on synodality because I think that for me, I think I've come to see synodality as a organ or a vehicle of the sense of the faithful, not in a democratic sense, right? Not in a we're going to take an international poll and come to a vote and agree on things. But
This is definitely what Francis and Leo think, what you just said. I mean, they definitely are explicitly linking it. They think it's Vatican II, sensus
oh,
fidelium, synodality, explicitly.
sorry. Yeah, sorry, Sean. I thought you were being sarcastic because of all the times Francis said, this is not a parliament. And all the people who were so concerned about the synod,
No, no,
assuming that
no,
it's
no,
like a
no,
parliament. Okay.
no. But I'm saying the there's a lot of there's a lot of, like, confusion about this,
Yeah. Yeah.
and like it's not confusing to me. It's
So,
messy,
okay.
but it's not. But
Yeah.
what they're saying, what the popes are saying, is exactly what you just said, and they've said it over and over and over again. And anyone who's confused about the principle of the matter, I maybe it's just because there's all these other voices going on, but it's not actually. The messaging from Rome is not confusing. The process is ambiguous and messy, but it's not the banner headline is not actually confusing. I think that's like a red herring that
Yeah.
people throw out.
So here's okay. So here's how I conceptualize it, and I want to bounce this off of you. If it's true that every single person has this innermost sanctuary where they are actually able to hear the voice of God, if it's true that every baptized person, as the Catechism says, is baptized as another Christ, and who, as Pope Paul VI said, is a member of a royal priesthood capable of having supernatural conversations with God. If that's true, then shouldn't the whole of the body of Christ, all of the different members, be in consultation with one another in understanding how the church ought to move through the world today and move through history? Not that everyone has the exact same role, because it's clear in there is a apostolic hierarchy, but it seems like that the apostolic hierarchy, if it doesn't speak on behalf of God, which it doesn't, would want to come to know how God is making himself manifest in the rest of the body of Christ, to know how to navigate the world today and to navigate the church through history. And that synodality is simply putting all of the parts of the body into dialogue with one another. Is that accurate,
Yeah,
or would
I
you have
think
a different sense of that?
no, 100%. I absolutely. And I as you articulated that, I actually was thinking that this is about the laity I mean, in the sense of actually bringing the laity literally to the table, right? At the synod. Um, it's about women, it's about priests in dialogue with bishops, it's about women religious, I mean, it's about everybody, right? It's about the people of God, the sense of the faithful, also including clergy, of course, and religious, etc. But I wonder if actually the prime motivation of Francis is clerical, in the sense that he's saying this is how you should be a pastor, right? Like if he thinks the immediate impact that he might be able to have, and it obviously depends on context how it's received, is to be the pastor of a parish is to be at the table with your people, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in San Francisco, maybe that's gay couples, right? If you're in Nigeria, it's people who are, living in close proximity with Islam, maybe an Islam that at times is violent and intolerant. If it's in Berlin, it's a highly secularized culture, and probably people that are struggling with that, overreacting to that, whatever it might be, right? So it's like genuinely, it's all the smell like the sheep, all that kind of stuff. But it's I think maybe ironically for Francis, it's like fundamentally about this is what leadership is. This is what a good Catholic leader should behave this way. For all the reasons that you stated. Um, Regarding the sense of the faithful, I wanted to say, so Newman is very clear that it's not a democratic process, and he was under intense pressure about that. I think he really didn't believe it was, but he was pushed. And the journal that originally ran these articles about sensus fidelium was shut down. It was called the Rambler, and it was run by lay people, which in and of itself was seen as a problem. Um, or primary contributors were lay people. So there's a link for Newman between lay control of education, or lay involvement in Catholic education and leadership making capability, and sensus fidelium. There's also a link with conscience. There's also a link with ecclesiology. When I talk to my students about sense of the faithful, an example I always give is I did this study of the three Good Friday prayers about for the Jews with my. It was actually a class on the New Testament, and we were talking about different New Testament representations of the covenant, enduring covenant, canceled covenant. What's going on with Hebrews, Romans, Galatians, etc. So we read these three prayers, and some of the students were Protestant, some were Catholic, some were secular. But anyway, I got home, and my wife is not in any way a kind of academic when it comes to theology or anything. She did a bit of undergrad stuff, but a very engaged Catholic, extremely pious, very, very smart. And I just said to her, let me read you these three prayers. So the pre-1959, the perfidious Jews, the normal Novus Ordo prayer, and then the one that Benedict used for the bringing some of these communities back in. And I read all three of them to her. I said, what do you make of each of these? And what she said, having never studied Catholic teaching on Jews post Vatican II, but her sense of this is how we view other people, this is how we view Jews, this is what we hope for, this is what we believe about Jesus and the uniqueness of Jesus. I mean, her explanations were, first of all, way less long-winded than mine would have been, and way less technical, and like completely brilliant. So I just think that kind of thing, it's a Newman says, we're not asking for their vote, we're consulting them the way that we consult a barometer to understand the temperature. It's a fact. He says it's a fact of the tradition. After the Arian or after Nicaea, the laity, which I know early historians challenge this at times, but that the laity were preserving faith in the kind of full Trinitarian understanding of the Godhead better than the clergy or
Yeah.
better than the
I
bishops.
mean, Leo says as much in Unitate Fidei this past fall.
Which point?
He says, oh man, I gotta look it up because it is uh, uh, it's a great line. Because he quotes, um, he says, Saint Hilary, on the other hand, testified to the orthodoxy of the laity, in contrast to the Arianism of many bishops, acknowledging that, quote, the ears of the people are holier than the hearts of the priests.
Yeah, so Newman is all about this argument. I know there's some historical debate, but definitely the witness of many of the fathers is that it's preserved by the laity, or the laity and the parish priests, and not the bishops. Maybe because the bishops were more under the sway of various emperors. Laity also around the Immaculate Conception. You know, the questions asked pre Vatican II, of course, with the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. Do you, Bishop Fahey, believe in it? Do your people believe in it? Do you think it should be proclaimed? Right. So the
Yeah.
fact of tradition, we can point to certain beliefs. Newman does this with the development of doctrine around relics. It's really important to Newman. You can theorize it. You can theologically get there, I think, pretty easily, but not at all easily to the Protestants that he's debating on this. But that the laity are attaching themselves to this devotion in union with a belief about the incarnation, a catechesis about the incarnation, that is a fact, right? So for
Yeah.
Newman, that fact is an important piece of the puzzle about how we then determine what does the church teach. In that sense, the sensus fidelium is extremely helpful. I think the problem comes, as I said earlier, when we want the magic list of 39 infallible teachings or 285 infallible teachings. That's when I think it just becomes, that's not what it's for, and we have to accept limitations and the relativity of the times we live in, and a lot of people don't want to do that.
Okay, so I want to kind of put some, I don't know, some meat on this a little bit. So, okay, I want to go back to that question I asked at the beginning, and I want to pull it out of a modern context. So, with all of our modern controversies, and then I actually want to put it back into a contemporary context. Okay, so imagine a faithful Catholic, educated faithful Catholic in the 15th century, who is convicted in their conscience that slavery is inherently evil and must be abolished worldwide. That it is just a gross offense against human dignity. This is contrary to the church's teaching at that time and to pretty much the church's disposition towards slavery previous to that for all of the church's history and following that for another like 400 years. Okay. Would this Catholic have been unfaithful to the church in some way by having this conviction in their conscience? And then if they publicly spoke out from this conviction, would they have been dissenting? Like, were Catholics in the 1400s bound to assent to the church's teaching on slavery at the time that it's okay in all of these circumstances, which would have been completely out of line with the church's teaching at that time, but perfectly in line with the church's teaching under John Paul II, 500 years later. So that's like the historical context. But we can move that into the modern context. And I listen to Catholics who like argue for same-sex marriage, for example, and they appeal to human rights and human dignity and dignity of conscience. I think of there was just a Belgian bishop a couple weeks ago who issued a pastoral statement, and in it he said, within 2 years I want to ordain married men as priests, and he says, not dissimilar from something you just said, Shaun. He's like, I've talked to all my pastors and talked to people in my diocese, and everyone thinks that this is what we need to do. So this is what I'm going to do. And he kind of throws down the gauntlet, playing chicken with Rome to see if Rome will allow him. What is dissent then, if you can have a Catholic who is completely faithful to the church's teaching 500 years into the future, but that's contrary to the church's teaching at the moment, when we don't know what's going to change or when.
Definitely. I mean, I think that was imprudent of that Belgian bishop, because I think that's not that you're not sinning by not ordaining married men. I mean, you can think it's unwise, right? So, I mean, I take your point with all of those examples. So let me establish. So what I would definitely be confident in saying is that if a church representative were to tell you at any time in history that you need to do something that leads to the abduction, mistreatment, torture, or death of another person, you shouldn't do that, right? And there's sadly many examples where that's possible, right? If you're a minor noble in France, and they say, we want you to go on this crusade, and we're gonna like attack Egypt or something, or I mean, it got so absurd they attack and sack Constantinople. I mean, it was just whatever justice or injustice in certain military expeditions at certain times to protect pilgrims or recover the holy way. It got obviously a parody of itself and absurd. Or there's a valid crusade at some point against Lithuanian pagans. Do you have a right to march in and demand conversion? And no, you don't, right? Now, it's difficult to say in the subjectiveness of the person, like we can sit here and make an argument with like texts about what, like we can find, and also with slavery is it's clear, sadly, that there are authorities in the church up to the Pope at times who say certain forms of slavery are in principle okay.
Yep.
Even if abuses and blah blah blah, right?
And to give permission to certain forms of slavery.
Yes, yeah,
at
right.
certain times.
To sanction them, right? Now it is interesting, and we texted about this, right, with the Holy Office. So the Holy Office in 1866, for the benefit of listeners who don't know this, upheld that slavery per se was not contrary to divine or evangelical or natural law, I think is the phrasing, evangelical or natural law. So the gospel or the natural law we know from philosophy, conscience, etc. Right? Now, you could still, anti-slavery people could still say, fine, but it's in South Carolina, the way it's being done, I guess you got to rewind a couple years before emancipation, but is unjust. So I'm fighting for that abolition, right? You could say that. But you couldn't say in every circumstance and be within the strictures of that Holy Office ruling, right? So interestingly, some people are now bringing that back up. The people who maybe didn't highlight those cases very recently, right? Now, the Capuchins, who were no one's idea of like Enlightenment progressives, the Capuchins were arguing and had been arguing since at least the 1700s, possibly earlier, that slavery was a violation of the evangelical law. So they said, fine, you can say under natural law, Aristotelian philosophy, it's not per se unjust, but we are called to the law of the gospel, and it is a violation of that. Propaganda Fidei, which was the Vatican missionary congregation, is, I'd have to go back and look. I'm actually editing a paper right now that went into great detail about this from a brilliant Italian historian. Propaganda Fidei is getting close to sanctioning that, or at least to aiding and abetting those friars. The Holy Office is different people, sometimes overlapping consultants, but different people, right? So I don't want to whitewash the history. I don't want to say there isn't a real problem here. There is. And when you have a rigid view of infallibility, I think it's a huge problem, right? But there is tension in the tradition that I think someone in good conscience could point to, could say, I respect your authority, Bishop. Sadly, one of the most interesting bishops of the early 19th century, Bishop John England, he was Irish actually, but Bishop John England of Charleston, South Carolina, defended in principle, with all the caveats of you don't mistreat him, but
Yep.
in principle defended a horrifically evil system of, I mean, how do you can't get much worse than slavery in Mississippi, South Carolina. I mean, horrible, 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 right? And he defended it, at least hypothetically in principle, that it's not per se wrong, right? Um, so that there is a huge problem, but there always are. There is a minority report. You could say, I respect your authority, Bishop England. I respect that you're pointing to this directive, but I'm also reading in the scripture that if I really love the Lord, I sell all that I have and I give it to the poor. So if the perfect disciple can't own slaves, I'm taking this argument from Brad Gregory, actually. Brad Gregory at Notre Dame has this brilliant insight. The perfect disciple of the Sermon on the Mount couldn't possibly be a slave owner. That's interesting, right? I'm also reading that God has special care for the orphan and widow. Everything that all the abolitionists would say, black pastors pointing to the Exodus story. So there's at the very least a viable challenge that a pastor needed to listen to. Now, where I think you can disobey in good conscience is let's say you're from Michigan, you're down in Charleston, you're a I don't know, you're selling furniture or something, whatever. You're in the port of Charleston and you're told at mass there are people that are helping Mr. Sutherland's slaves escape. They're committing a mortal sin. They're aiding and abetting servile revolt. They're stealing, and he holds these people with a just title, which has been affirmed in our theology, right? I think disobeying, insofar as you say, no, I'm privately, of course, because it's the Underground Railroad, I am going to aid and abet, you know, this black man and his wife and children get from Charleston to Greenville and be hidden. I think that's entirely justifiable. And of course, there would have been some Catholics at the time who would have said it was justifiable and some who wouldn't. But the party line, I mean, at least in the sense it's sad. Even in 1834 was Gregory the 16th's blistering anti-slave trade encyclical. He doesn't
Yep.
say you must free all of your slaves,
Yeah, it was
right?
it was Bishop England. Wasn't he clarifying Pope
Yes.
Gregory's
Yeah.
teaching to
Yeah.
say, oh, he's just abolishing the
Yeah.
trade, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but they're already here, so we can do what we
Yeah.
want.
What I've heard about this, there's a young Jesuit that wrote a really good overview of the history of slavery, and then there's a much thicker, heavier volume going into more detail by an African historian, whose name escapes me. But the the theory is that Gregory personally, it's just sad, it's funny given what the pro-choice politician thing that we'd hear all about. I personally oppose, but Gregory personally opposed slavery, but they were worried about a diplomatic relationship primarily with Brazil. And
Yep.
they were worried either it won't work if we say free all your slaves, or they'll be able to retaliate against Catholic
And
organization or whatever it might be,
and
right?
and Pope Leo the 13th only condemned slavery as
Yeah,
a whole after
yeah,
almost all of the other world powers had condemned
yeah.
slavery as a whole.
Yep, absolutely. I've heard some horrible, horrible whitewashings of this history by, I hope, well-meaning Catholic apologists, So it's funny to me now that some of them are bringing up the 1866 Holy Office ruling to say, look, the CDF can just be wrong. So they're wrong about co-redemptrix or whatever, right? So no, there's a problem here, and there's a problem. I think we have to be honest about what I always present to students is indefectibility is the belief which we share with the Orthodox and with I would assume the vast majority of Protestants, which is that the Holy Spirit will protect the church from destroying itself and from an inability to transmit the gospel message. The ability to transmit the gospel message will never be eclipsed, no matter how much sin, ignorance, uh, problems in the world. There will always be the transmission of the word, of the sacraments, of prayer life, of holiness, of all the sort of markers of the church. Infallibility is important, and it's important that we have a certain understanding of ecumenical councils and ex-Catholic statements, and I affirm all of that. But what's, I think, when we're considering these kinds of questions, we have to look at this painful, messy process where the gospel message was never abandoned, even if it was effaced and marred by our sins and our participation in these evil things, right? But God's promise, first and foremost, is that that message will endure and will act as a leaven. And that something like slavery, I mean, the real miracle when you look at world history is that it was ever abolished. I mean, it's not been totally abolished in the sense that we have all kinds of exploitative
Yep.
slave-like systems today. But the miracle, really, as sad as it is for us to look at all these justifications, but the miracle is that we got to the point where it is now, like if I went into my Catholic social thought class tomorrow and I said, hey, what do we think about slavery, guys? Like, let's hear the pros and cons. I mean, they would be
There'd be no
horrified,
debate.
absolutely
Yeah.
horrified, right? That is the leaven of the gospel in many ways. Not that non-Christian countries have never gotten there, of course, but the reason that I am horrified by watching a movie like Amistad or Roots or whatever is because of a gospel leavened, and also Enlightenment and other factors, but a gospel leavened movement in the United States and elsewhere that won arguments against other movements. And we can't escape that subjectivity. Now, what do we say to people today who have very strongly held beliefs? Again, I would say if a pastor is telling you to actively do something or to cooperate in a system that is harming you, you must refuse. I don't think that gives us license. I have my own ideas about various issues. I don't think it's justifiable for this Belgian bishop, as much as I see the prudence and wisdom of having both celibate and married clergy. We don't do that. I don't think that's a Catholic mindset. I think it's one thing to say we need to have very serious talks. This is what we envision. It's very pro body. It's this. It's this. That's great, and and pushing is fine. We need to push about all kinds of issues, but you can't. I don't think you can unilaterally just do something like that with our current I mean, this is how our ecclesiology is developed. We live within that, and we need to be respectful of it. On the other hand, I would say that something like the abuse crisis, I think, does need to open our eyes more to there were spiritually abusive pastors who were trying to use ecclesiastical authority to silence whistleblowers. That kind of thing has to be disobeyed, but not the commission of the reform, right? Which is so maybe leaking papers to the police when you know that there are abusers being shuffled around. That's, I think, entirely valid.
Yeah.
But if I
Yeah.
ordain you, because I think there should be married clergy, I think that sort of thing is just just first and foremost imprudent, but also counterproductive to reform.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind, and we mentioned this in our last discussion, was like the story of Sister Helen Prejean, and Father James Martin interviewed her on his podcast a couple months ago, and it was a really great interview. But she talks about her advocacy work with people on death row, and she shares how in the '90s she had a conversation. She ended up having a, a meeting with John Paul II, and she shared with him the stories, like her experience of relationship with inmates on death row and their execution. Like she talks about sharing with him like what it was like standing there watching the state execute a helpless individual. And you know, the way that she tells the story is that she thinks this conversation in some way moved John Paul II to change the church's teaching on the death penalty in Evangelium Vitae, which is a really significant development in the church's understanding. Um, in my mind, that seems like a quintessential example of thinking with the church, but then bringing those who are being most harmed and putting their reality into conflict, right, with the current teaching in order to create some movement here. But it's hard for me personally. So if that's like a positive, like a quintessential example, I mean, I know of Catholics who say, for example, on like gender issues, where they would see like gender affirming care as saving someone's life. And by Catholic hospitals refusing to do it or saying that it's mortally sinful if you do it, you're actively harming somebody. Um, but I imagine most Orthodox Catholics, at least in the US, would feel like really uncomfortable with a Catholic doing that type of advocacy, the way that Sister Helen Preaching does her advocacy for people on death row. But how is that not essentially using those same tools and doing the same type of thing? Um, like, is it that there's some issues and some teachings that are off limits? I mean, that doesn't seem logically coherent. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
don't
I
know.
mean
There's
I
not really a
think we
question
can't.
there.
No. This is all I mean it's so difficult because we're looking into the past at stuff that now looks obvious to us, right? Like Inquisition comes to your door and says, we heard that there are Lutherans around, and that I mean, now to participate in the torture and we're horrified by that, right? I mean, any normal person, I know there are some sick people on the internet who would debate this, but I mean, any normal person now would view the Underground Railroad people as the heroes, right?
Yeah,
So we can't escape the our subjectivity right now, and that we're seeing, we see through a glass darkly, uh probably ethically in certain ways, certainly theologically until the S. So like there's a limitation there. Now I would just say the reason we can't escape the circle here is because and this is what's so difficult about the teaching on conscience. If a medical student said to me, I'm a Catholic. I believe in the basics of the faith. Or I believe in the gospel. I pray. I go to mass. But it is my belief that women sometimes need abortions, sometimes not just to save their life, but because their circumstances have changed, or because of fetal abnormalities, or because whatever. I believe the woman has the right to make that decision, and I want to be a doctor here in Sydney, Australia, or in Detroit, Michigan, or whatever. I would say I think you're wrong. I don't think that you should perform abortions except to save the life of the mother or something like that, right? I don't think you should perform elective abortions. Um, I think you need to be honest with yourself that the church rejects this. Um, and I don't think I would say the next thing, but I probably would have to if I was their spiritual director or their confessor. I don't think you should present yourself for communion, right? At the end of the day, that person is on a journey. They're required to form their conscience as best they can, and they must follow their conscience. Not I can't change their I can say my bit, and if I'm in some sort of position of authority over them, which I wouldn't be as a layman, right? you're telling me that this is against the teaching of the church, as much as I empathize with your desire to provide health care with women in unfortunate circumstances. This is not compatible with so we have to follow our consciences, our pastors have to follow their consciences, and the people were, and there's no escape from that. There's no way to, I mean, we coerce as a society when if someone were to say, well, my conscience says that I'm going to blow up the abortion clinic. Well, no. We don't stop them from doing it. Of course we stop them, right? And I think this is also the seduction of integralism, with the reason that this is because in our liberal political system, which I would affirm at least the basic vision of, Enlightenment liberalism or constitutional democracy, etc. Integralism is a way of saying, well, we want you to go to heaven. And in order to get you to heaven, we're entirely justified in certain types of coercion, which I think go way, way, way beyond what the church now affirms as valid coercion. I mean, valid coercion for the church is excommunication, interdict. I mean, it's all stuff involving sacraments. And
Yeah.
it's all spiritual stuff. I mean, you can lose your job in the sense that we say, well, sorry, Archbishop Fisher could say, I don't want you teaching at Notre Dame because you said all this crazy stuff, and Notre Dame could fire me, right? I wouldn't, that's not something he doesn't have the right to at least advise them. I don't know his exact relationship, but it's basically spiritual penalties, right? And the allure of integralism is to say, let's get out of this uncomfortable ambiguity and just say, Catholics need to behave this way. Catholics need to vote this way. Catholics need to do, and so we're living in a I think a time where there's so much beauty and promise, but we're leaning into the frailty and the ambiguity in ways that in Newman's day, I think Newman is saying, hey, we need to acknowledge this at all, whereas now we're just swimming in it, and it's disorienting. And that's why we have extreme ideologies are offering a way out. I think it's a fool's gold, but I get the allure of it, because it's really, really difficult to live in this kind of, with the historical consciousness that we now have, is a two-edged sword. It's beautiful, but it's also like, hang on a second, like me, a white guy, if I was born in 1786 in the same place in Durham, outside Durham, North Carolina, in 1786, what would my opinions be in 1826? Probably not good. Probably not great
Yeah.
when it comes to slavery and race, stuff that we now look on as horrifically evil. What, that's hard, that's scary. I think most people in history haven't had to encounter that in quite the same way that we now do through mass media and through education. I mean, they had some sense of, well, Romans exposed their infants, Romans watched people get ripped apart in Colosseums. I mean, they had some sense of that. But I don't think someone in France in 1226 is thinking, what would I have thought in 1026? I don't know that was
Yeah.
something that was plaguing them, but it plagues us, and
Yeah.
it's hard.
Yeah. It's an interesting moment. I mean, this is like very relevant to the day that we're recording this, but yesterday was Palm Sunday, and in Pope Leo's homily, he said, uh, God does not hear the prayers of those who wage war, coming 2 or 3 days after the U.S.'s Pete Hegseth, the
Yeah, yeah,
head of
yeah.
the Department of War, gives this just gross, disgusting prayer asking.
It was like something that like a crazy young guy on Twitter would write, and it's the Secretary of War. I mean, it's just unhinged
Yeah,
stuff.
so it's hard not to read Pope Leo as responding to the world global superpower.
He probably is. I mean, I presume he is,
Uh,
right?
but this is all happening in real time on Twitter, right? Like
Yeah.
everyone's watching this. And no, like I don't have to agree with Pope Leo, every opinion Pope Leo has about every geopolitical conflict. But at the same time, um, there's a level of not coercion, but like exhortation in what Pope Leo is
Hmm.
saying. Like, God is against war. You ought
Yeah.
to be too.
Yeah. 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 And that's absolutely entirely appropriate. It's just that the framework that we're now in, the kind of authority, I think it's actually been really good for the papacy in the last 150 years, but the kind of authority is just moral suasion, right? It's just witness. It's really powerful. I mean, I think the death of Francis and the election of Leo have shown us. I mean, the Pope is a very significant moral voice in the world for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and that's a cause for hope, I think. But it's only in the. I mean, this is what Christ did, though. This is why. This is like to go back to our past conversations about religious liberty. I mean, Christ is exhorting, and I think when we try to enter the gap of into coercing, whether it's with force or with abuse of conscience, which you've talked so much about, I mean, that's where I think we enter into a I don't want to say antichrist, because so many of the people doing this I think have good intentions, but a non-evangelical mode. And ecumenism, to go back to an earlier point I made, I do think that an injection of ecumenical sensitivity and ecumenical dialogue around these matters has really helped us, maybe paradoxically, to recover other parts of our own tradition on a lot of these questions. I mean, the whole ecclesiological project of Vatican II is a recovery of bona fide Catholic stuff, but I think it's through an awareness of, whoa, 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 we forgot about that part, or we muted that part. And I mean, Congar, people like Ratzinger and Congar were seeing this in some conversations with Lutherans, Reformed Christians, etc. And we had to get back the baptismal priesthood of the laity, right? It was never completely gone. Maybe that's something with indefectibility too. Even the pieces are never completely gone, but there are times where we have to pull them back. But no, I'm totally. I don't have a solution to the problem, because I don't think it's possible. I hope that's not a cop out, but I don't think it's possible other than to say the person who thinks they have to do XYZ um, is responsible before God for their actions and responsible to form their conscience. And unless you're stopping criminal behavior, you can't go, when you're a layperson, you can't really go much beyond that. Pastors sometimes have to step in. I think there are times where pastors need to step in and say, this is something that separates you from communion. I actually agree with the conservative Catholics on that. I think that the proper response to attacking all these Democratic politicians is not to say, no, 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 we never do that. It's to say, how do we do it? Why do we do it? It can't be done in a partisan way. It can't be done. It must be done in a truly
Cannot be done in a
pastoral way.
partisan way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
mean, anyway, we could go on a huge rabbit hole about this, but it's been very clear that certain pastors don't even have a framework for doing this outside of one issue, right? Which is
Yeah.
very destructive to the church's witness. But I do think that there are circumstances where the pastor also has the right of conscience and can also say, this is not. I'm not in a position to give you communion. I don't think
Yeah.
that that's by nature coercive.
Yeah. Um, Shaun, we blew past our timeline. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that I didn't ask you about in this conversation?
No, not really. I think we could have many more conversations about how this all plays out ecclesiologically, and I'm really fascinated. At some point, we should have a conversation also about Pope Leo, because you've been doing so much with I'm blanking on her name, but that wonderful young
Sarah
woman you've
Carter.
been, yeah, 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 with Carter, Sarah Carter. Yeah, you've been having all these conversations about the catechesis on Vatican II, and I think we're clearly Leo is trying to inherit the synodality project and keep it going. And the manner in which he does that, it looks Newmanian to me. I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to help all these conversations that we've had about morality, conscience, church history, synodality, sensus fidelium. All of this is of a T. So no, I'm just looking for. I'm so happy to be alive right now, even though I know things are crazy. I think we're living in a really a really cool time for the church, actually.
Shaun, where can people find and follow you if you want them to?
I have a page on academia.edu, so you could just Google me and find that if you're interested in kind of all the academic stuff that I've written. I also have written a number of things for the Church Life Journal. A lot of it is sort of deep dives into early modern stuff. I'm obsessed with Jansenism, and that's the first time I've said that word this whole time. So if anyone wants to learn my take on all that, you're very welcome to
Oh,
read some of that stuff. Vatican I, Vatican II, the Enlightenment. Those are some of the things I'm interested in.
awesome. Shaun, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening to the Third Space podcast. If you like this conversation, please subscribe. Episodes will be released every other week. Please share it with a friend and give it a rating and review on your favorite podcast app so that other people can discover the show. You can sign up for my newsletter or send me a message at catholicthirdSpace.com. And while you're there, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. All of your support directly helps my family and allows me to continue working on projects like this podcast. You can also join me at Smart Catholics, the online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations that go beyond easy answers or black and white fundamentalism. That's smartcatholics.com. Thanks for listening.